I changed rooms.
We're
so
live.
hopefully the
We're live right now. So welcome everyone
Hello.
to our wonderful panel, the AAPI Book Month panel, Intersectionality in APA YA. So to start off, I thought that I would let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves. We can start. Sarah, do you want to start? And then we can just go around. I think Sarah's frozen. Okay, CB, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm CB Lee. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the author of the Sidekick Squad series, which is about a group of queer teens taking on a corrupt government superhero agency. Oh, I forgot I actually brought books. Sidekick Squad. I also have a short story that's in the anthology Out Now, which just came out last week.
Yay. Okay, Lyla?
Hi, I'm Lyla Lee. I'm the author of I'll Be the One, which comes out next month. And it's about a bisexual Korean American teenager who enters a K-pop competition in order to become one of the world's first plus-size K-pop stars.
Yeah!
Yay!
I'm so excited.
So exciting. Malinda?
Hi, everyone. I'm Malinda Lo. I think I'm best known for my first novel, Ash, which is a lesbian retelling of Cinderella. My most recent novel was A Line in the Dark with this hand on the cover. How does this work? It's a psychological thriller about a queer Chinese American girl who is kind of in love with her best friend and the things that she does for her. It is a psychological thriller, so they're not all good things. But that was my most recent book.
Yeah. Okay, Rahul?
Hi, I'm Rahul Kanakia. I use she, her pronouns. My most recent book is We Are Totally Normal, which is a contemporary young adult novel about this guy, Nandan, who, although has lots of friends and he feels like his image is like a little douchey and like people don't understand him. And after he ends up hooking up with his best friend, Dave, he's like, oh, maybe I'm gay. Like, maybe that's it. That's the thing. And so he comes out and he's like, oh, I'm gay, and like starts dating Dave, but it just still like doesn't quite feel right.
Great. And Sarah?
Oh no.
Is she frozen again?
Well, in the frozen window, you have Sara Farizan, who has popped off, but will return shortly, who is the author of Tell Me Again How a Crush Should Feel, and
If You Could Be Mine.
If You Could Be Mine. And most recently, I have her book on my shelf back there. Should I get it? What was it called?
I'm Here to Stay.
Here to Stay. Yes.
Wait, I looked up her bio. She has an MFA from Lesley University and a BA in Film and Media Studies from American University. So,
and she's very funny. So we're really missing out.
But hopefully she'll pop back in as we chat. So just to dive right in, as I mentioned, this panel is going to be all about intersectionality and intersectional identities. And so I thought that we could kind of start this panel off and have all of you just speak to the idea of intersectionality and how you use it in your books and in your characters and kind of what that means for you as an author. So anyone who wants to kind of just jump on in.
I'll jump in to start. I feel like basically I kind of, from a craft perspective, I think that considering your character's intersectionality is really the baseline of character development. Like if you want to create a three-dimensional character, that means you have to consider all dimensions of their being, right? So in my books, I have written about characters who are queer, and also some of them have been Asian American. Some of them have been queer and Asian American at the same time, which I know is shocking because, we don't really exist. Like we're not really real. those of you are seeing us, but we're not really here. So this is a lot of, so that's really where I start to think about it. I think about it as the baseline of my character. Like I want to think about all of their different characteristics, their race, their class, their gender, their sexual orientation, and all of those things kind of work together to make them who they are. And I try to do that with every single character. You know, I mean, it's obviously mostly with the main characters, but every character that is in the story obviously has multiple identities within them. So, and that affects everything about who they are. It affects how they talk. It affects where they live. It affects what they like to eat. You know, all of these things are affected by multiple valences of their identity. So that's where I start.
I think one of the ways I've approached it was that, you know, when I first started writing, you know, and just like in terms of like media and representation and like what you would see like on TV, if a show, like if there was like a queer character that was like their entire person, like that's all like one aspect that we got to see of them. And then for a very long time, I was like, oh, like being queer, being a person of color, like the people that got to be queer on TV were like white cis gay men. And predominantly that was kind of like the stories that we were being seen. And that's not like that's not the only story that exists. Everybody who's experiencing the community is a reflection of like, you know, like a disabled person has a different experience, a queer disabled person of color has a different experience, and all of these intersections stack on top of each other, which informs the way you like look at the world, how your experience has been shaped. And I thought a lot about this writing because, like, you know, I don't know how many of you thought when you're like crafting character, but one of like, you know, people when I was like writing Not Your Sidekick, people are like, oh, she's like a bisexual Chinese and Vietnamese American character. That I feel like are you there's like so many things happening at one time here. And I was like, but I am also all of these things at the same time. Like these intersections exist in real life. And I feel like addressing intersectionality shows that like there's no community that's a monolith. Like even if like in the Asian American community, there's so many different experiences, you know, whether you're first gen or second gen or like your particular background. And, you know, your, as Malinda said, like your class, your like all these different things that stack on top, it informs how your experiences. So I'm really excited like within fiction that we can see you know, as more and more writers are like, hey, like you know, I'm excited to like have more of these characters showing that there's no one way to be Asian American or there's no one way to write a queer character. Like you can be multiple things at the same time.
I think that's such a good point. And not only can you be multiple things at the same time, but like all of those different things you're experiencing them simultaneously and continuously. And you can't just like parse out pieces of yourself.
Yeah, I had a similar experience to CB in that, like, when I first started writing books as a teen, well, I was growing up reading books like, about and by primarily like, white authors. So, like, I remember when I started writing books, I wrote books about like white characters, and then like I feel like it wasn't until I was in my 20s that I started like branching out and writing about like Asian characters or queer white characters, and like and like it was like a whole process where like when I was first coming up with this book for I'll Be the One, I like went through this entire process where I was like, oh well, would it be too much to make her Asian and bisexual, even though I myself was Asian and bisexual. So like I definitely think that's a thing that I think we all go through.
Yeah.
Should
And
be,
like,
oh yeah.
go ahead.
No, you.
Oh, I was gonna tack on that like experiences can kind of inform the other too, like within like even like within like mental health, like characters with specific you know, it manifests it differently in different communities, and like there's different resources and different understandings.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, building off of that, there's this idea that within a person, you can have kind of like conflicting identities. And so I'm wondering, just like as people and creators, how you use your work to explore kind of like the intersections of your identity and the fact that sometimes these things can conflict or they can just like be at odds with one another, and how that like comes out in your work, and if your work has helped you kind of like explore and come to terms with that part, those parts of yourself.
I mean, so my understanding of intersectionality is that it's not just about identity. It's like kind of intimately linked to oppression.
Yeah.
And that all of the like, it's about like having multiple oppressed identities. And I think it is, what's been interesting for me is just like how much like my work is kind of read through the framework of intersectionality and of oppression, and like the characters' conflicts are kind of read as being the result of oppression, or are as being like somehow intimately tied to societal oppression. And I mean, I don't know. I guess like I feel like that now, being a millennial, like that kind of thinking and way of reading text is very much a part of me, and it's like part of how I approach texts and come to them. But I think there's also like a part of me that really struggles against it. Is like, oh, there are stories to be told about people who have various attributes that are intimately tied to those attributes that are nonetheless not about oppression, or at least not about oppression in like the way I would think. Like when I write, or at least, I write like, just intersectional stories because I am intersectional. And I write about people like me. And I think I just like to think about like, I've always felt that queerness just has different attributes from straightness, like that it is something, I mean, with a few exceptions, like people aren't, born knowing they're queer, like it's something you assume or take up. And that's like kind of part of our story, but I don't know that it's necessarily, and then that has, connections to race, but I don't know that it's necessarily intersectional. So I guess what is like kind of like having to like look into or think about how the story is read, which is, like especially in YA, like by bloggers, teachers, librarians, it's like read in this very like, oh, how is this book opposing societal oppression way versus kind of how I write it. That's I think the main way that intersectionality informs my writing.
That really brings up so many like interesting topics, because I feel like I think about this all the time where I'm like, okay, I'm gonna have these characters have this background, but then I also have the pressure of like, what am I personally doing in this book to address these issues, and do we want to, and can I write free of that, or will everything that I write be informed by that anyways? And so as part of it's like, I'm curious about what other people think of, like when you're writing, do you intend or not intend, or how do you no, it's a really good point. I'm just like, I'm gonna chin hands here and like I want to hear what everyone has to say.
What was the question? Do we
Like, do you address it specifically? Like, I think when I first started to write like my superhero series, I'm like, oh, I love superheroes. It's fun, save the world, shenanigans, robots. And then it became this bigger thing that I wasn't expecting, because the idea of like a queer Asian superhero took on a life of its own, and people are like, this is important now. This is important because of this. And I'm kind of straddling that line of like, it can be important but also fun. I don't know. Like it's
I feel like for me this is oh, go ahead.
I think if you write queer books, it's like they're always being called important, which is like, okay, yeah, I guess it's great. But part of me is just like, no, not important. Like, it seems so just like dull. I don't know. I somehow, some part of me like viscerally like really reacts against the idea that like a book can be like good for you or important.
I
Is it,
hate good for
do
you
you,
books. I
is it
hate
that
them.
you want as an author? Do you think it's the idea that you just want the freedom to be able to write any kind of experience you want without having kind of like that external pressure that this book has to stand up and like be something to so many people?
I don't feel that pressure because I have taught myself since I started. I've been writing professionally for a long time now, and I have learned that I cannot allow that pressure to inform my writing because if I'm going to tell the stories that I want to tell, that I feel very strongly about, I have to listen to the voice in my head that is me, not all the external voices. And so I see this pressure. I know that we all feel it to write these like perfectly represented people. And as members of those marginalized communities, we feel some sort of responsibility, right? But I feel like you have to work very hard to mindfully focus on your own creative goals that may or may not align with the external discourse on intersectionality and representation, because that is going to kill your creative fire. If you know what I mean? There's a difference between the creative voice inside you and the external analysis of your work when it's completed. And I think that it's very hard in this community online. And if you believe in equity and diversity and inclusion, it's very hard to not let those external voices kind of put you on a fixed path. And it is literally I have to daily remind myself that I'm here to tell my story that I want to write.
Hi everybody, I'm sorry about all those technical difficulties. I'm Sara Farizan, and I borrowed my mom's laptop because mine is old. And my latest book is Here to Stay, which came out in 2018. That handsome young man, and I'm known for intersectional and important books, like If You Could Be Mine, and Tell Me Again How a Crush Should Feel. And I've often talked about this with Malinda over the years, because Malinda has, like for many of us, has been a huge person to look up to in writing, especially for young people. And
don't give away all my secrets, Sarah.
I know, but I think we've had discussions. I'm talking about on my end where I was very, like my first two books were written in a graduate school vacuum. So they were things that were important to me and that I wrote about because they felt very personal, even though the stories are fictional. And so does Here to Stay. But I think once the first two got published, the idea was, okay, I want to talk about these issues that are important to me and that often have a lot to do with identity, but they are very different stories from one another. And as someone who's been invited to a lot of important books panels, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity, sometimes I think people haven't even read the book, which is understandable. There's a lot to read, and I sometimes think they just look at the jacket and they're like, oh, that sounds important. We should talk about that.
Oh my God.
But then they'll be like, oh, you're funny. I didn't know you'd be funny. Why are you funny?
I told you she was funny.
Why are you funny? That's
yeah. I think part of me is used to it because they're like, one, I can't tell if they're asking because I'm a woman, because that's a thing, which is another panel. Happy to talk about that. The other is like, given the subject matter and the characters that are in my stories, they're often of Iranian heritage and a lot of queer subject matter. So I think that sort of throws people off. and to your point, CB, Carrie, the thing about like wanting to have just an adventure, right? Your character happens to have aspects of these identities, but they still get to go on an adventure. I think now I'm exploring that more in my work, and more deliberately, because I mean, there's still going to be identity things and different lenses that I have, or that different characters that are not like me have. And it's tricky writing characters that are not like you, because there has to be thoughtfulness that goes into that. You know, like I write characters that are not like me, but I also want to make sure I do a good enough job that someone's not like, this is egregious and how dare you. And, you know, and sometimes that's, maybe I have done not great thing. I think we all think about this because we want to make sure that we are, I mean, I can't speak for all of us, but for me personally, like for a long time, I felt like I was the only one in the village. Now there are a lot more books. There's like a Love Story by Abdi Nizamian. There's Darius the Great is Not Okay. There's books by Arvin Amadi. So there's like other stuff. So I don't feel like, because there's no way that one author is going to totally encompass every person of that group. It's impossible, and it's not fair, especially when it's coming from a different cultural context that maybe people aren't used to. Now that you got me on here, I can't just shut up.
No,
You're like, I like the technical difficulties better.
You bring up such a good point, and it's something that I think about a lot in terms of the authors that I work with, is the idea that there are so few of these books that are out there, and we're talking about pressure and just the added amount of pressure that you must feel as authors to try to represent as much as you can for as many readers as you possibly can in one book. And I deal with that with my authors a lot, just the idea that like you want your one book to just be able to be everything for everyone, for all of those kids who don't see themselves in books, which is such an impossible goal. And it's not really a goal that anyone can ever meet, and it's just like kind of like setting yourself up for misery.
No one should think their book is going to be the one. No, don't think that if you're a writer. Like, that's
I'm
impossible.
going to tell all of my artists, Malinda Lo said no. So
you're writing the book for you. You have to be writing the book for you.
Yeah.
There's yourself.
No, like one true representation. I think like, you know, as a writer, you have this fear. We were talking about the pressure earlier of like, you know, people like society or publishing at large assigning like, okay, this book is important because it has these identities, and they are important. It's just hard to like accept that mantle. And when like, and I think a lot about like when Sarah, you said like, oh, they're just going on adventure, but I think all of your works, whether it's like comedy or romance or, you know, mystery, or, you know, I feel like being like all of these different types of stories are important because they aren't like, they don't have to be like huge systematic like takedowns of oppression and addressing like systemic racism or like, but the fact that the characters of color, that queer characters, that like people with intersectional backgrounds get to have adventures and just to exist at the center of the narrative is powerful.
Thank you. I think my worry for a long time, and now I'm kind of throwing it out the window a little bit because I'm getting older, and also, you know, the world is just such a shit show that I feel like we all have a place to exist, and like this, we're fucking here to stay. Sorry, can we swear? Other kids watching. And you know, it's like I did worry a long time that like, okay, like if you're an English teacher or you get to have a book on a summer reading list, right? And then that kid finds it, and that's great. I prefer summer reading list versus like an English class. English class you can discuss, but the idea is like, oh, we'll stay PG-13. But yeah, so it's kind of like, I don't want people to be like, well, I read that one book, so I know everything about that group of people. We don't have to read anymore. Like, we did it. That's our quota. Like, good for us. So I think that was one of my bigger kind of issues with that, is like, oh, that must be, you know, it's very limiting, and then I'm not gonna do that anymore. I'm gonna continue to try and be thoughtful, and I hope I am, and hope to be a better writer, but like, you know, I also just want people to read my work. I don't know.
Yeah, I just want to add in that, like, for me, I feel like I never really felt that external pressure, but I think that has to do with, like, part of it is the fact that, like, I think the youngest person here. So I like grew up, I like saw like Melinda's. I'm sorry to make you feel old, but I saw Melinda's books in my school libraries, and then I saw
Okay,
like
I know.
That's fine.
and I saw
That's
and I saw like
fine.
Carrie's like books like on Twitter. So like I feel like for me, I was like, oh, there's like a space for queer Asian lit. This is awesome. So like I was like I just felt like I was joining the team, which I felt really grateful for. That being said, I also wanted my characters to go on like an adventure, but for me, it's like a K-pop adventure because I always wanted to like write a book about K-pop. But I will say that I think my book didn't really start with queer characters. I feel like I actually got this K-pop storyline first, and then as I was writing, I was like, well, I'm Asian, I'm queer, and then I have all my friends who are a lot of my friends are Asian and queer, and why is it like why should her friends be straight or white? Like why can't they be Asian like my friends? So like which is why like my book has like she's bisexual, or her future boyfriend's bisexual, and then like her two main friends are like lesbian. So yeah, so hopefully like I don't know I don't know where I'm going with this, but like I just thought that was very interesting about what Belinda and Carrie and Sarah were talking about.
And she does go on an adventure. I have read it, and it is amazing.
Yeah,
it's a great adventure. So you guys are all gonna love it. I think that kind of what we're talking about dovetails really nicely into the idea of the Own Voices movement, which I think for YA literature especially has been undoubtedly a very powerful movement. But now I see in the industry and on Twitter and in like those spaces, it has become something of a shorthand for any writer who writes from their own experience, no matter if those are traditionally marginalized experiences or not. And so I think what I would want to know is, from your perspective, do you think the Own Voices movement is kind of aligned with the ideals of practicing intersectionality, or do you think that we've kind of, as a community, outgrown this movement and need to kind of move past it?
These are very good questions, by the way.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's too soon.
These are very intense, deep questions.
It's been like a really intense week, and so I'm in a very intense place.
So why not just stay on that same level of intensity?
Yeah. Oh boy. So I think my first book came out before Own Voices. So maybe we can talk about like before Own Voices and after Own Voices, right? Like what that meant. So, and my first book came out before We Need Diverse Books was around. I think Malinda's Diversity in YA was kind of one of the only things on my radar for diversity in publishing sort of kid lit stuff. So what I like about Own Voices and Own Voice books is that I feel like the person that is writing in that voice has a vested interest in the people they're writing about. So I don't like the idea of people sort of becoming trends, right? Like, I'm going to write this story, but why don't I make this character this identity because that's really hot right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is I'm saying people can write whatever they want to write. You can't dictate what stories they want to tell, but it has to be important to you, and you have to feel like you care about the people that you're writing about. and two, that the kids that see themselves in that group feel validated and feel cared about. So those are my sort of, when that was happening, I was like, okay, this is great, because and again, that doesn't mean that someone can't write a thoughtful book with characters of different identities, and I'm not saying it's impossible.
I like that way of thinking about it, though. It's kind of like a reader first approach, which I think is something that's often lost within the industry.
Yeah, and
I think that's how it was originally conceived, right? Like Corinne wanted it to be a kind of like a way to find books for readers to be able to find books. It wasn't meant to be any sort of like limiting necessarily. It was like a tag, you know, like on Archive of Our Own or something. So it wasn't necessarily supposed to be a limiting thing where people had to stand up and proclaim and like come out, you know what I mean? So I think that that's kind of how it has changed since we started using that.
Yeah, it's become sort of it's so funny, and you know, I've been doing this for like 7 years now, and I'm still figuring it out. I still don't really know all of it, but sometimes I have to be like, in my mind, like, we're writing for young people, right? Like, we're writing for kids. Like, I mean, adults read it, and that's great, and I love it, but we have to keep kids and teens and students in mind.
Well, what does that mean for you?
For me, it means like there has to be some sort of pedagogy a little bit. Like, that's just for me. That doesn't mean that that's, you know, people want to read fun things and maybe you'll get some, but for me, like, there has to be some sort of like, I don't want to say like after school special message, but some kind of like, I'm trying to get you to empathize with these group of people. And maybe you won't, and maybe the story doesn't speak to you, and whatever. But personally, that's what I've been trying to do for this time. And the other thing is that, like, writing is a very private, personal thing. And I'm generally a very intensely private person. But I feel like a lot of the marketing and a lot of the selling of our work has now more to do with like, what a great personality, and wow, they're really sharing a lot of their, and I did not want to write to have to expose everything about myself. That's why I write fiction. So I think that can be kind of tricky too. It's like asking people who write to sort of not only, I mean, you know, just for me personally, I can't speak to anybody else, but I think that's been sort of tricky about, you know, deciding, well, are you this enough? Are you that enough?
Yeah, I agree. I feel like, you know, the intention of the hashtag was made to uplift books written by people from those communities, but it's definitely created another set of pressure where you have to prove that, like, you know, it makes me nervous when people have to come out if they're not ready to come out, or if, you know, they have to disclose their like sexual assault or that they're a survivor. And it puts, you know, people in difficult positions to say like, oh, you know, and that's not on one person or the like readers, or, you know, it's on, you know, multifaceted people within editing and publishing, from like people who are like, oh, like, you know, if your publicist says you need to disclose this, or like, and that's because they're like, that'll make you more marketable, that's a specific response to what they think you need to do, because they, you know, they're like, oh, it's a trend now, or I don't know, it makes, yeah, the idea of like, you know, diversity being a trend is not, it makes me viscerally uncomfortable, because it's not like, a trend is something like a fashion thing, like plasticky jackets from 2000, like that came and then it went.
Track suits. Yeah.
Yeah.
No one really wore those.
Right, but like,
yeah,
people from marginalized communities have always been here. It's, you know, but with a lot of platforms, like a lot of platforms that are much more visible now, makes it easier for people to talk about these issues more. So it seems like diversity is a trend when we're all here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like you guys have like a different view of own voices than I do. I always just assumed that it was a hashtag we made to like make sure we get more of the diversity pie, right? Like, do you guys not feel that way? Like, there's like a certain pie, the diversity pie, and like I have no idea who's reading these diverse books, to be honest. Like, I know that like in my books, I'm like, I know that there are white girls who read them like because it's like, I don't know, like sexually exciting to think of like two boys together, and that's not like the diversity audience. Then there's also a diversity audience. I don't know who those people are. I'm not 100% convinced that it exists, to be honest.
I think it exists. I've gotten so many messages over the years. I know that they exist, but they're not always involved. They're not on Twitter. You know what I mean?
No, but I mean an audience of people who want to read books about people who are not like themselves. Like I get plenty of
I see what you mean.
messages from queer people or like from Indian people. Yeah, but it's like publishing isn't publishing books so that they can be read by like 10,000 queer Indian teens, right? Like,
I mean, I wish.
They should. They should.
They're being published. Well, they're being like how you want to be read by those 10,000 queer Indian teens, but you would also like to have a chance of being read by like 100,000 other people. And like I don't know if that is there. Like I don't know if 100% like if that is really there. Although there have been all these like when Dimple met Rishi, there've been all these like Indian American romances, and I am like, oh, you know, like white people like that for some crazy reason.
I think it's too like seeing the success of books and that a lot of the readership does not a lot of the readership is not that book, right? Like I've read a lot of books that don't have characters like me for a long time and still continue to do so.
Yeah, but you're probably not a typical reader.
I don't know. I read a lot of comic books, mostly.
I think
I'm not a typical reader.
Like all of these things, like it was a way to find these books. It was a way to uplift these authors, and it was a way for people to like. And I think the attention and the movement and the visibility of the hashtag has been good overall, where it's pointed to a need. Where and it's great not only for like that audience, but also and it comes back to like that windows and mirrors question of like, oh, it is important to also read stories about people from other communities, but it's a very nuanced and complex conversation because it's like it can both be good and also impact us in like pressuring ways, and there's like stressful components and like different ways in which it manifests and changes. And
well, I'm glad we solved it. I'm glad
we're going to solve all the questions in one panel.
That's the point of this panel. Like this panel isn't over until we've fixed the young adult literature. So
it's the new quarantine.
Yeah.
It's the intersectionality quarantine panel. I just wanted to say something, Rahul, because you brought up the idea that I hadn't actually thought about too much, but like cross-cultural reading, I guess, like white readers reading books about Asian characters or something. But I think that it is there. I think it has grown, and I think that you can see that it has because of books like Angie Thomas's The Hate U Give. You can see that that book is being read by everyone.
Yeah.
And I think that there are a few books that do cross into many different readership groups. And I think that's great. And I think that books like The Hate U Give can prime readers to be open to reading more widely. And I see that I see publishers trying to market across cultural groups when it comes to their, what their book cover design, the way they situate it, the blurbs they put on the cover. Like you can see them trying, I'll just say it bluntly, you can see them trying to reach out to white readers. You can see it.
Yeah,
and
I agree. Yeah. Like publishers definitely want to reach white readers.
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
don't know how big that readership is.
I think it's there, and I think it's growing. And I think the more of these books we put out there, like we're teaching white readers to enjoy books about characters that aren't like them, you know, because as Sarah said, like I've read so many books about people who are not like me. Like I can't tell you how many books about like white romances I've read. Like I've read a lot of them in my life, and I
read a
lot
of books about guys getting a divorce.
Yes.
Like more than I ever thought. I mean,
yeah,
a lot of
so
divorces.
like if we can identify with these white dudes getting divorces, you know,
so many
it's possible. The other way around works too.
And they don't know what they did wrong in all of them.
What are these books? I need like a Sara Farizan reading list, please.
You are gonna be like, I don't know about this.
Like Broody McBruderson?
Yeah.
Is he sadly like staring into a glass of his whiskey?
Not that bad. Not that bad.
Fireplace.
I had a huge John Irving phase, and I still like his stuff. But I just know he's always going to mention wrestling. He's always going to mention a private school in New Hampshire, and he's always going to talk about Vienna, Austria. I don't know what that is. I think he went there once and really enjoyed it. But it's in all of his books. Like all of them.
Does he really like the sound of music or something?
What's that?
Does he really like the sound of music?
No, I think he maybe like went there for a little while. I don't know, but like I'm always like, why are we talking about Vienna again? You know, we're in New Hampshire. But I enjoy his work. I don't know. I'm from New England. I live in Massachusetts. I don't know. So yeah.
Well, everyone should expect a reading list from you sometime soon. We'll have another panel to discuss the works of John Irving. I don't know about that.
He's got plenty of press. He's doing fine. Yeah.
So I think I'm going to ask one more question, and that'll be the last question. And then if anyone who's watching the panel has questions that you want us to answer, feel free to type the questions in the comment section, and we'll pick a few after this last question. So I think something that we were talking about, and Sarah, that you touched on is the idea of like where we draw the line as readers and as authors of who can tell what story. And kind of related to this, I was curious to know all of your thoughts on the use of authenticity and sensitivity readers in YA, which I think alongside the Own Voices movement has been a really positive step for the community. But kind of like in the age of Twitter and Goodreads reviews and considering the idea of intersectional identities, and that even within families and communities, no two experiences are necessarily the same. Where do you draw that line of like who can tell what story? Another complicated question.
Yeah.
Alexander Chi has a go ahead.
Oh no, you should go. Go ahead.
Personally, I've never met another Indian American person who agrees with me on this. So it's like really like my own opinion and nobody else's. But I don't know. To be honest, I feel like there are like 1.4 billion Indian people in the world, and they make more movies than any other country in the world. They like make music and write books, and it's like even Indian Americans are like 1% of America and write so many books and won the Pulitzer Prize and like done all this stuff. I just feel like Indian people are doing okay. Like it's like there are plenty of Indian people writing Indian stuff, and if some non-Indian people want to write like Indian stuff, even if it's really stupid, like it's okay. Like it's not gonna harm, it's not gonna harm India. It's not gonna harm Indian culture. So I don't get too worked up about it, and I don't serve as a sensitivity reader. I have been asked. I just feel like I would rather you just like take your chances, like just take your risks. Like maybe your like stuff comes out and it just gets savaged and torn to hell, but like maybe you like say something different and interesting. And either way, you'll probably survive.
So I like that perspective.
You did it.
I was mentioning Alexander T has a great article on writing the other, or 3 questions you should ask yourself before launching into a writing project. I highly recommend it. It's on Vulture, so you can access it online. But it's a really helpful resource for people looking to write outside of their lived experience. And, you know, first ask yourself, you know, why do you want to write this? And I think in terms of like, it puts you in a perspective of like, is someone else already writing it? Can you uplift their voices? And then how do you do it respectfully? Which is part of the thing is like, you know, it's writing. Whatever work you want to put in, that's the work that you're, you know, do your best to be respectful, do your best, and like how it's going to be received, that's entirely on like, there's no controlling that. And so I feel like I'm just making hand gestures now.
I always like to say that I believe that all writers have the right to write whatever they want, and all readers have the right to read whatever they want. So just because you write something doesn't mean that people are going to have to read it.
Yeah, or necessarily.
We can all make those choices for ourselves. And I think that that's something key. Like, I'm not here to police people about what they can or cannot write. And I think that it's not a good thing. You know, like I really love Rahul's openness to writing and reading. I think that's really generous. I think that's really generous. And I know that I personally have felt that I'm kind of done reading white male writers writing about Asian women. I'm kind of done with that. Like,
they get divorced too.
You know, I've read that and seen that enough. So I'm not saying they can't do it, but I'm done reading it.
I think I had someone, you know, DM me when I used to go on Twitter, and when people liked my first book, and she was like, "Oh, I'm thinking about writing this book that's set in the 1950s about an Iranian character." And I said, "That's great." And she was like, from her avatar was, you know, a lady of European descent. And I said, "That's great, but why? Like, I know that's interesting, but why? And do you have some sort of like, do you have friends or family?" Like, basically asking, like, do you know us? And there's a lot of us to know, and you're never going to know one person fully. Do you know what I mean? But because there have been so much Western media about Persian and Arab and Muslim people that is egregious, it does sort of then take a toll on those people, right? Like, then you're chipping away at people. So if a book is a fun story and the character happens to be this, and, you know, they know some like Persian words, and, you know, it's just, he has curly hair, like, okay. And even then you're like, all right. But if it's like, oh, my childhood best friend, we're still close, I went over his family's house all the time, like, he's still my best friend, I gave it to him to read to make sure it was okay. I mean, that's a lot, right? That's a lot to ask of any. But the idea being like, who are you serving? If you're serving yourself and you want a movie deal or a TV show or whatever, and you're like, yeah, that'll be cool, and you're welcome to do it. It's a capitalist economy, and, you know, congrats on making it hard for other people. But I think if you're really thoughtful and care about the people you're writing about, it's important. So, but that's, I would like to write about a white guy getting a divorce. Do you think they'll let me?
I think you should. I would read it. I would read any Sarah. any books by you.
They'll totally praise you for being able to inhabit the mind of a white guy.
Yeah. Like, what did I do wrong? I thought we were good.
As long as you talk about Vienna, Austria, I think that you're fine.
Okay. I've never been there, so I don't know. I'm sure I would probably write about it if I went too. It's beautiful.
You can set it in New Hampshire.
Oh yeah, I can drive up there.
Mm-hmm.
Live free or die, you know.
That's right.
Okay, so I think that we can take some questions now. Oh, here's one. Do you all feel like your publishers ask you to use your personal life as promotion tools often, or do you feel like they keep it to the books? I feel like, Sarah, you were touching on that earlier, so I'm excited to hear.
My publisher's been great in that aspect. I think sometimes there are certain words that I'm like, okay, or like in the bio, can you mention that you are actually, you know, Iranian American? Just so they know. But no, they've always kind of let me do what I want to do, which is really, and they're great. They're smaller, so maybe sometimes you don't get like as large a reach as you would like, but they've always been let me do what I want. They're just and they really care about the stuff that they're putting out there. I feel like, you know, and because they have a smaller list. It's Algonquin Young Readers. Hi guys, if any of you are watching. You shouldn't be. It's Friday night. You don't need to watch it. They work enough, yeah. But I think for the next project I have with them, which is not announced or anything, it'll be interesting because it's different from what I've done thus far, and the identity of the characters do play a part, but it's not the huge story arc or like anything like that. So I think it'll be interesting to be like, I think I've done my sort of identity trilogy, or like things that were on my heart and important to me regarding aspects of my identity. And I still will continue to pepper that in, but I think now I'm just kind of want to tell like fun adventures that are still, you know, about kissing and basketball and, you know, whatever. But I think there's kind of a put on upon sometimes by like readers, or being like, hey, this book is, you know, and you can't fault because you're like, I want people to read it. So, you know, but sometimes I feel a little like you're happy that anyone decides to spend time with a story because it's time, right? It's time they could be doing anything else. But I hope people just like the stories and also think they're important, but both. I have to tell you, one time I went to like Y'all West, which is a huge deal, and I was so happy to be there. And I was on like a lot of, you know, panels that had to do with intersectionality or, you know, being queer and that sort of thing. And I was on one panel where it was like a mystery panel. And I was like, oh yeah, Here to Stay does have a mystery element. I'd completely forgotten because it was all about like Islamophobia and prejudice and sports, and, you know, and and it was me and like Gwenda Bond, who had written Suspicious Minds. And so Matthew Modine showed up and I was like, Matthew Modine? This didn't happen to me. Like, and it was like Gretchen McNeil and Karen McMahon, like all these like, you know, mystery writers. And I was like, and me, we're talking about genre? Talking about craft? This is great. So I'd like to do more of that. And I hope the books are good enough that people consider that. That was a long-winded answer. Sorry.
That was great. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I mean, to be honest, the way publishing works is it's not like your publisher asks you to do things. You beg them to let you do things. Mm-hmm. It's like publishing, you sell out preemptively and hope there's some kind of reward. Like a friend of mine told me a story about his friend who had gotten a huge book deal, but like because of her principles, she didn't want the size of the book deal to be announced. Like she'd gotten, I don't know, like $1 million or something.
Wow.
She didn't want anyone to know. So then
I would,
she was like,
yeah. And we're all going to be like, really?
The agent was furious. The publisher was furious, but they were accepted. And then the book came out and no one noticed. She's like, she called up her agent, was like, why is nobody paying attention to the release of my book? It's like, well, you didn't let anyone publicize that it was supposed to be like a huge, big, important, paid for a lot, you haven't gotten a lot of money paid for it book.
I'm like very shocked that the publisher agreed to not announce the size of the deal. That's like, wow.
Well, at the point when they're paying you $1 million, they really want you, so you can get them to do stupid stuff. Like paying you $1 million is already pretty dumb, right? So
if anyone wants to pay me $1 million, they can totally announce it. Yeah. I'm good with that.
You know, we're all available to work.
That's right.
I'm available to receive.
Yeah, and
money at any time.
we're all happy to disclose any information. You know,
so if anyone wants to use any aspect of my personal life to sell my books, it's kind of like,
I don't know. I don't know about that. The personal. I mean,
well, it's I don't think there's ever been like, for me personally, because like my publisher has never asked me to like, oh, like what do you want to do? Like what it was. I ended up coming out to my entire extended family at my book launch because I forgot that I put that I was queer in my bio, and I forgot that like I was actually, I don't know, my family is like very weird in general, but they were like, oh, you're doing a thing, you're having a book party, and I'm like, yes, I'm having this, it's important to me. I mean, and then my mom was like vaguely like on the fence if she was going to come or not going to come. But then she showed up, and my dad and my aunts and like a bunch of people, like cousins and other people came, which I was not expecting at all. But it was just very surreal and interesting. But in terms of like, no one asked me to put, like, no one was like, oh, you should have this in your bio, or no. And I think I ended up talking about like, you know, there's a lot of like in marketing and stuff, they're like, oh, you should go on like a blog tour, or you should do these interviews, it'd be great. And so, you know, I was very new, and I was like, I don't know what to do. So I guess it's good to talk about yourself. I don't know, marketing your own work is just like a strange strange thing, because it's very it's like, oh, I've written a book, I don't know how to talk about it, and yet I still have to.
So I know that some of us have to go right at 8, so I think we have time for one more question. Let's see. Oh, great. Is there one thing you personally will never write about besides divorced white men? I applaud.
I might write about them.
I applaud you.
I'll never write about.
Everyone's thinking.
Architecture.
Architecture.
I think for me,
because, I mean, when I write books, my least favorite part is like describing how buildings look, because I'm a very visual person, so it frustrates me to have to like describe the picture I'm seeing in my head on text. So I could never write a book about architecture.
That's amazing.
That's a good one.
I think I would never write a fantasy. I'm not good at it.
I don't know if you can say that.
I have fantastical elements coming, and I like a superhero. I like a superhero story, but they are usually set in like a city that exists, or like.
We're gonna see a Sara Farizan fantasy, I bet. Pretty soon.
Well,
I think your definition of fantasy is
I'm gonna hold you to this. Like, one day you might be like, I want to write a fantasy.
Well, then people would read my stuff and they'd be like, this isn't important. This is fun. Love this.
I write fun fantasies, and they're all super important, Sarah. Join me on this.
Well, we can't. Melinda, you're a legend. I mean, what am I gonna?
Yeah, whatever.
I walked into a queer bar in New York with Melinda, and people came up to her and were like, "You're Malinda Lo."
Amazing.
Our free alcohol, you know.
That was pretty funny. We didn't get any free alcohol.
We sure didn't.
Hey, that bartender was like, I don't know who you are.
And I bought like a drink for somebody. I think I bought you one, which is fine because I rolled in like.
I'm so glad that this moment is immortalized on YouTube forever.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Also, I don't advocate drinking, but.
No, bad.
If you do drink responsibly,
nobody ever drinks in my books ever. They don't do anything before the legal age.
That's not true.
No,
and what's the legal age for drinking in Fairyland?
It depends. It depends if it's a fantasy world or a real one.
Yeah,
and also, what year is it?
Yeah, there's a lot of like mead in fantasy, right?
Okay,
Yeah, and it
CB,
was
Malinda, and Rahul, I want you each to say in one word a book that you would never write, and then I think we got to wrap it up. One word.
True crime.
Oh, that's good.
Oh, I want to say that too.
You can
Can I
say
say true crime? I'm saying true crime.
I don't know. Never say never. I
Never say
Okay.
never.
That was a great note to end on. I want to thank all the viewers for coming and watching our panel on intersectionality in APA YA, and I want to thank Asian Author Alliance and Kat Cho, and definitely go to asianauthoralliance.com to learn more about AAPI Book Month, which is wrapping up, but there's still a lot of great panels coming up. And thank all the panelists. You guys did a great job, and I'm so happy to be here to moderate and listen to all of your wisdom. So thank you.
Thank you for all the questions.
You guys,
Yeah,
I
thank you.
had a good time, and I think we
great.
solved it.
We solved it. I think we did
We
it.
did it.
Nobody has to talk about it anymore. Good job, everybody.
Great.
And thank you, Rebecca, for moderating. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
It was my first time
You
moderating.
did so
I
amazing.
did not
You're
doubt
great.
you were
You're a great
excellent.
moderator.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
And yeah. Fun. Are we still here? Is this? Yeah. Okay.